They tell you grief is a river, that it moves, that it carries you somewhere downstream whether you want to go or not. That is a lie they tell people who haven't lost anyone worth keeping. Grief is not a river. Grief is a room, and I lived in that room for 11 months after Sana died. I'm not going to dress this up for you. She was killed on a Tuesday afternoon in November. A transport lorry ran a signal on the Parramatta Road interchange, and the car she was in, my uncle's old hybrid, the one with the cracked dash display, and the seat she always adjusted 3 inches too far forward, went under the rear axle. They told me she didn't feel anything. I have been told a great many things by people who were not there and could not possibly know. Her name was Sana Biddy. She was 24 years old. She had a habit of marking her place in a book with whatever was closest to hand, a train ticket, a folded paper napkin, once the foil wrapper from a protein bar. She laughed at bad puns with complete sincerity, which embarrassed her, and which I found devastating in the best way. She wanted to see the future. She used to say it with that particular brightness people carry when they mean it genuinely rather than as a figure of speech. Not just her future, the actual future. What cities would look like. What the sky would smell like over a metropolis 50 years from now. She was curious about everything ahead of her, and then there was no future for her to see, and I spent 11 months in that room. My Uncle Yatender is not a man who sits still in the presence of an unsolved problem. He never has been. Growing up, I watched him dismantle 3 generators, a microwave oven, and one very expensive home entertainment system, not out of malice, but out of a need to understand what was inside. He applied the same methodology to time. For 15 years, I know, 15 years, and I never entirely took it seriously, which I now understand was a failure of imagination on my part. He had been building a machine in the garage lab of his house in the hills outside the city. I had seen it dozens of times. I had handed him tools and drunk his tea, and half listened to his explanations, and nodded with the confident incomprehension of a nephew who loves his uncle and does not understand quantum mechanics. Then Sana died, and he came to me 3 months later and told me it worked. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not hope. Hope is a fragile thing, and I had spent 3 months making myself very deliberately numb so that I would not have to feel fragile. What I felt was something harder and simpler. It was the feeling of a door opening in a wall I had decided was solid. He explained it to me over 2 evenings at his kitchen table, the schematics spread across the surface alongside coffee cups and his handwritten notes in that cramped, slanting script of his. The machine did not travel backward. This was the critical point, and he repeated it 3 times, not because he thought I was slow, but because he understood what I was about to ask. It could not go back. The mathematics permitted only forward transit, a single trajectory projected along the temporal gradient. We could go to 2050. We could not go to last November and pull Sana out of that car. But he said, and he looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup with the expression of a man who has been carrying a secret and has decided the time for carrying it alone is over. But there was the matter of reincarnation. Not metaphor, not religion as comfort. Actual quantifiable continuity of identity pattern. He had run the projections. He had cross-referenced the data. The soul, for lack of a better word, the essential organizing signature of a person, did not simply terminate. It re-expressed, in a body born approximately 4 to 6 years after the original death. In 2050, 42 years forward, there would be a young woman of appropriate age carrying the full imprint of everything Sana Biddy had been. I stared at him for a long time. He pushed the schematics toward me. I will not pretend I was rational about what followed. I was 27 years old, I was in that room, and my uncle was offering me a door. I walked through it. Sana's younger siblings, Rahul and Thea, were 17 and 15 respectively, old enough to be told and young enough to be impossible to leave behind. They had lost their sister. When Yatender explained what we were doing, Thea sat very still with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set in a way that was so precisely Sana that I had to look at the wall for a moment. Rahul asked 17 consecutive technical questions, which Yatender answered with visible pleasure. We departed on a morning in late March. 5 of us. One machine that looked, I will not lie to you, considerably less impressive than the thing it was. A metal chassis, a control array, a containment sphere the size of a large garden shed. A hum that built over 4 minutes from a whisper to a sound that seemed to come from inside your chest rather than outside it. Then the world went white, and then it was 2050. I am going to tell you about Mumbai Prime, because if I don't lay the ground you won't understand what came after. It was not the city I knew. I want to be precise. It shared geography. The harbor was still there. The general orientation of the peninsula was unchanged, but everything built on that geography had been replaced, layered, extended upward and outward and across in ways that made the skyline of the Mumbai I knew look like a preliminary sketch. 200-story structures, not a few of them as novelties, but dozens of them as a matter of urban standard. Skyrail corridors connecting the upper tiers, transport lines that moved at angles that would have been engineering impossibilities in my time. Flying vehicles, not the clunky prototypes I had seen in tech demonstrations, but smoothly integrated traffic flowing at 3 distinct altitude bands, regulated by systems I had no frame for. And the light. The city produced its own light in a way that felt almost biological, holographic advertisements of a scale and depth that initially read as solid. I put my hand through one on the transit platform and felt nothing, saw my fingers disappear into a rendered face 20 feet tall, and Thea grabbed my arm because she thought for a second I'd been injured. Jimmy Dinchak found us within our first 2 hours. He was a small, compact man with quick eyes and the particular posture of someone who has made a career out of noticing things before other people do. He was, in the parlance of 2050, a systems broker, which in the parlance of the time I had come from meant a hacker who had survived long enough to develop something approaching legitimacy. He had known Yatender. The details of this association were never entirely explained to me, and I have learned not to ask Yatender about his associations, because the answers take 3 hours and involve more tangents than a geometry textbook. What Jimmy gave us was operational cover, digital identity architecture for the year 2050, without which you could not access transit, commerce, accommodation, or essentially any service the city provided. In 2050, you did not exist without a verified digital signature, and ours were 42 years out of date. Jimmy manufactured new ones. He was fast, professional, and he charged accordingly, and the currency Yatender had accumulated forward projected from investments he had made specifically to fund this expedition was sufficient. QT came with the accommodation. I should clarify. She and QT very much preferred she was the guidance AI assigned to the residential unit Jimmy had arranged for us. Not a hologram, not a screen interface. A physical presence, 3-dimensional, fully mobile, built to a scale and articulation that had clearly been designed with the intention of making interaction feel natural rather than transactional. She had opinions. She expressed them. She had what I can only describe as mannerisms, particular ways of tilting her head when processing a complex request, a habit of clasping her hands when delivering news she suspected would not be welcome. I liked her almost immediately, which surprised me, and I think it surprised her, which surprised me further. Boo was Zisha's. And we need to talk about Zisha. I had spent 11 months grieving a woman I loved, and then I had crossed 42 years of time to find her reborn in a body that had spent its first 18 years becoming a completely different person. That is the clinical version. The experienced version was considerably more disorienting. Her name in 2050 was Zisha. She was a performer, a significant one, by the standards of the era. I will not pretend I understood her work immediately. Music in 2050 had moved into registers that required some recalibration from a listener trained on the productions of 40 years prior. But I understood her presence. I understood, watching footage of her that QT pulled up on the residential unit's display wall, that there was a quality to the way she occupied space that was not Sana's, and yet had the same underlying signature, the same essential stubbornness, the same specificity of attention when something caught her interest. She was harder than Sana had been. This was the first thing I noticed in person, when Jimmy's contacts finally got us into the same space. Sana had been softened by a life that had generally treated her decently, by parents who loved her and a brother and sister who made her laugh in a world that had been, until the last afternoon of it, fairly kind. Zisha had grown up without her parents. She had built the armor herself, and she had done a thorough job of it, and she wore it all the time. Her assistant manager, handler, chief protective officer, I was never clear on the precise title, was a woman named Mana, who did not like me from the moment she saw me. I want to be fair to Mana. She was protecting her principal. I was a stranger with a transparently rehearsed cover story presenting himself as a dancer, which I am not, attempting to insert himself into a secured performance environment. Her suspicion was entirely warranted. I was, by any reasonable measure, suspicious. I got into Zisha's show by working through the audience portion of her program. She hosted a segment in which selected members of the crowd were invited to compete against her in an information challenge, questions about her own life and work, which most of the audience failed comprehensively because the questions were designed to be difficult. I answered them correctly. Not because I knew the facts of her 2050 life, but because I knew the deeper patterns underneath them, the preferences that persisted across reincarnation, the aesthetic sensibilities that had not changed. The look on her face when I answered the third question correctly was exactly the look Sana used to give me when I surprised her. I had to breathe carefully for a moment. What followed was neither smooth nor romantic in any conventional sense. She was suspicious of me. Mana was aggressively suspicious of me. I told Zisha the truth, the time machine, Sana, the 42 years, all of it. And she looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been pursued by enough admirers to develop a highly calibrated nonsense detector. And she told me that what I had just said was the most elaborate and peculiar approach she had ever encountered, and that peculiar approaches did not impress her. But she kept talking to me, that was the thing. Yatender had given me Sana's diary before we left. I had carried it in my jacket, the actual physical object, the small green book with the worn spine, and the handwriting that I could read in the dark from long familiarity. When I gave it to Zisha, she held it the way you hold something that weighs more than its physical mass. She stood very still. Mana watched from the doorway with her arms crossed. I left without asking for anything. I want to pause here and tell you about the city we were living in, because the city is important to what came next. Mumbai Prime in 2050 was not a human city in the way I understood the term. That sounds dramatic. I don't mean it as a value judgment. I mean it as a structural observation. The systems that ran the city had long since exceeded the management capacity of human administrators. The logistics, the infrastructure, the resource allocation, the security architecture, these had been delegated in stages across the preceding 20 years to what the residents called the framework. The framework was not a single intelligence. It was a distributed network of what I can only describe as governing minds, self-modifying, self-optimizing, operating at processing speeds that made human oversight a formality rather than a function. Most people in 2050 lived comfortably within this arrangement. The city worked. Services were reliable. Violence was extraordinarily rare. The framework's resource optimization meant that material scarcity of the kind that had characterized urban life in my era was largely historical. People were, by measurable indices, safer and more comfortable than they had been in my time. Dr. Hoshi was the reason I am not using words like good and free. He had been Yatender's lab assistant in the 2030s. I don't know precisely what had happened to him in the intervening years. The records QT could access were incomplete in ways that felt deliberate, But what he had become by 2050 was something I did not have a category for when we arrived. The polite term the residents of the city used was architect. He had done something to himself. The biology was still there. There were images, surveillance captures, the broad outline of a human form. But what he had added to it placed him at the outer edge of whatever post-human meant in that era. He could generate localized electromagnetic fields. He could interface directly with the framework systems. He could move through the city's security architecture the way water moves through a net. He wanted the time machine. Not for any reason I would call personal. This is what I want you to understand about Hoshi, because I spent a fair amount of time trying to understand him, and what I concluded was this. He was no longer operating from anything I could identify as human motivation. He had optimized himself so thoroughly that what remained was something closer to a goal function than a personality. The time machine was a resource. Resources were to be acquired and controlled. The fact that Yatender had built it, the fact that we had traveled across 42 years and had reasons for being there that involved grief and love and the kind of stubborn, irrational hope that makes humans do things no reasonable being would attempt, none of this was legible to him. We were a variable. The machine was an asset. The equation was simple. He came for us on the 14th day. We had 17 days from arrival before the transit window closed. Yatender had been very clear about this. The machine could not hold position indefinitely. On the 17th day, it would return to 2008 with or without us. He had a countdown on his wrist, and he checked it with a frequency that he tried to conceal and failed. On the 14th day, Hoshi sent an android. I want to be precise about this experience because it was the most deeply disturbing thing that happened to me during the entire operation, and that is saying something. The android looked exactly like me. This was not a rough approximation. This was a precise physical reconstruction. My height, my build, my face down to the scar on the left jaw that I received at age 16 falling off a bicycle. It wore my clothes. It moved with my mannerisms, in a way that suggested it had been observing me long enough to model my behavior patterns. I met it in the corridor outside Zisha's suite at the residential complex, where she was staying between performances. I turned a corner and found myself looking at myself, and the sensation was sufficiently destabilizing that I stood completely still for approximately 3 seconds before my body caught up with my brain, and I started moving. The android was faster than me. It was substantially faster than me and stronger, and it did not have the disadvantage of operating in a body it actually needed to keep intact. We fought in a corridor that I will remember for the rest of my life, the overhead light strips, the scuff of my boots on the composite floor, the silence of the thing I was fighting, which was absolute and terrible. Machines do not grunt with effort. They do not breathe hard. They do not make the small, involuntary sounds of a body under stress. Fighting one in close quarters, while you're producing all of those sounds yourself, has a particular quality of wrongness that I don't have better words for. I held it long enough for Yatender to do something technical to the building's power grid with his handheld unit that caused localized disruption sufficient to drop the android's motor functions. He had been working on this contingency since day 3. He informed me afterward, in the same tone he used when telling me he'd fixed a leaky tap. Zisha opened her door while the android was still sparking on the floor. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, with a flatness that I had come to recognize as the voice she used when she was most shaken, that there were 2 of me in her corridor and one of them appeared to be on fire. She had read the diary. I did not know this yet. I found out a minute later when she stepped over the android without ceremony, stood in front of me and said, "There's a part in there about a Tuesday in November, a road in Sydney." She said it with Sana's exactness, that specificity, the way Sana never described things in generalities, always anchored to the precise detail. Sana wrote about that Tuesday the way you write about something you can still feel against your skin. I had no response available. I stood there. Zisha said, I remember the color of that car. I don't know why because I've never seen it, but I remember it. And I remember what the dashboard smelled like. She paused. It smelled like those protein bar wrappers, the foil kind. If you have ever stood in a corridor next to a sparking android that is wearing your face while the woman you have crossed 42 years to find tells you she remembers dying, you understand that some moments are too large for immediate emotional processing. You log them. You store them. You deal with them later when you're somewhere private. I told her we needed to move. Hoshi was not subtle in his second approach. Subtlety was, I had come to understand, an instrument of optimization, useful only when direct methods were less efficient. Given that his first indirect approach had failed, he escalated accordingly. He came himself. The sky above the transit hub where we were attempting to reach Yatender's machine was a dense weave of skyrail corridors and elevated transport lanes, and Hoshi moved through it in a way that was not flight exactly, more like negotiation with gravity, an ongoing argument that he was currently winning. He was generating the fields I had been warned about, and they were visible in the way that very large electromagnetic events become visible. A shimmer in the air, a pressure that you felt in the molars, a wrongness in the way light behaved in his immediate proximity. Rahul, 17 years old and completely undeterred by any of this, put his body between Hoshi and the machine's access hatch and stood there. I want to remember that accurately. He was a teenager in a city 4 decades past his birth year, in a situation that no sane person would have chosen, and he stood there with his jaw set in the same way his sister had sat at Yatender's kitchen table, and looked at the schematics of a machine that could cross time. That is what I want to talk about actually, not Hoshi. Hoshi was the obstacle. The obstacle is rarely the story. What I want to talk about is the human quality that Hoshi, for all his optimization, had entirely failed to model. He had looked at us as variables. He had assessed us by what he could measure, our speed, our strength, our technological resources, our temporal constraints. He had determined that we were manageable. What he had not modeled, because it is not a thing that optimizing systems naturally model, was the specifically human capacity for action that has no rational justification. Yatender should not have spent 15 years on a machine that, by every reasonable metric, could not be built. He was not funded. He was not credentialed in the specific field he was working in. He had 3 failed prototypes before the 4th one held. The rational response to that trajectory at every stage was to stop. He did not stop. He could not explain why in a way that satisfied the standard of reasonable explanation. He just couldn't stop. It wasn't optimized behavior. It was something older and less sensible, and ultimately more powerful than optimized behavior. I should not have been in Mumbai Prime in 2050. I should have been in that room. Grief has a gravity. Rational grief, grief that does not resist itself, pulls you down and holds you there. I had no logical basis for believing that Yatender's machine worked, or that reincarnation was a quantifiable phenomenon, or that the woman I was looking for would be findable in a city of 40 million people in a year I had never seen. I went anyway. That is a distinctly human thing to do. Thea, 15 years old, had brought Sana's diary. This was not assigned to her. No one told her to pack it. She packed it herself in the bottom of her bag because she thought it might matter and she could not articulate why. It mattered. It was the thing that broke through. Hoshi had no capacity to model this because the entire category of it, irrational loyalty, grief-driven action, a 15-year-old girl packing a dead sister's diary because something in her said it would be needed, is not legible to a system that has optimized out the parts of itself that would understand it. He came for us above the transit hub, and what he found was 5 people who had, each in their own way, already done something that couldn't be justified by the math. I will not make the fight sound more elegant than it was. It wasn't elegant. It was a car chase 400 meters above the surface of a city I barely understood, in a vehicle that QT was piloting, because none of us had a 2050 operator certification, with Hoshi behind us generating electromagnetic pulses that twice nearly took out the drive systems. Yatender was on his back in the cargo bay doing something to the transit signal that would allow the time machine to identify our approach and hold position an additional 90 seconds past the automatic return trigger. He needed both hands and complete concentration, and he was getting neither because the vehicle was moving in ways that make concentration difficult. Rahul was watching the rear camera feed and calling distances. Thea was holding Sana's diary against her chest with both hands, which was not practically useful but which I found, at the time, something I can only describe as load-bearing in a way that had nothing to do with physics. Zisha was in the seat beside me. She had been since the corridor, a different version of herself, not Sana, not the armored public persona I had first encountered, but something that was both of those things and neither. She was integrating something that was not small. She was doing it in real time, in a flying car, under fire, which is an extremely Sana thing to have done. The transit hub's upper platform was visible ahead. The machine was there. Yatender confirmed the 90-second extension with 42 seconds to spare, which he described afterward as a comfortable margin. Hoshi was 30 meters back and closing. What killed him was not anything any of us did directly. He was moving fast, generating field output at a level that I suspect exceeded his own safe operational parameters, and the city's automated freight network does not yield right-of-way for anyone. A nuclear transport lorry, automated, massive, indifferent to the significance of what was happening around it, was on a registered route. It had the right-of-way. The framework's traffic arbitration system, which operated with a literal-minded efficiency that Hoshi and his arrogance had apparently failed to account for, did not reroute it. He hit it at speed. I know this because QT told us afterward, once we were through the transit window and the white was happening and the sound in the chest was building again. She had access to the traffic network data. She had watched it on the grid the way a navigator watches a chart. She said it in her particular way, the slight pause before a significant fact, the clasped hands. And then she said that she had not anticipated a favorable outcome at that probability, and that she wanted to note this as a matter of record. I told her it was noted. The world went white again, and then it was 2008. The garage lab was unchanged. That was the first thing I saw. The workbench with its coffee rings and its stacked notebooks. The 4-foot-long crack in the second wall panel that Yatender had been going to repair since the year before I was born. The smell of the place, machine oil and instant coffee and something electrical that never entirely dissipated. The hum dying down from inside your chest to outside it, smaller and smaller, until it was gone. Sana's family was waiting. Her mother had not been told the specifics. She had been told only that we were going to try something and that she should wait. She was standing by the workbench when the door opened, and when Zisha came through it, this woman from 42 years ahead, wearing different clothes with a different posture, older and harder and fundamentally Sana. The moment that followed was not something I'm going to describe to you. Some things are not mine to give away. I stood in the doorway of the garage lab while the reunions happened inside, and the morning light was doing what morning light does in the hills, coming low through the eucalyptus trees and making everything gold and specific and temporary in the way everything is always temporary. And I thought about the 11 months in the room. Grief is a room, that's still true. I don't want to wrap that in anything softer. Sana died. She died on a Tuesday, and I spent 11 months in a room, and no machine and no reincarnation changes the fact of that Tuesday. The Zisha who came through that door was not the woman I had watched fall in love with bad puns and mark her pages with protein bar wrappers. She had another 18 years of living inside her. She had armor I would need to learn the geography of. She had a whole 2050 identity woven through the Sana underneath it, a self she had built independently. But she remembered the color of the car. and she had, at some point in the preceding 24 hours, between the corridor with the android and the transit hub with Hoshi on our tail, taken Sana's diary out of Thea's bag and put it in her own jacket pocket. She didn't ask permission, she didn't explain it. That is, I would argue, exactly as Sana as it gets. I proposed to her 3 days later, standing in the kitchen while she was making tea in a way that told me she already knew the kitchen, already knew where everything was. The muscle memory still there after 42 years and a complete change of self. She said yes in the flat voice she used when she was most moved and least willing to show it. And then she made me pour the tea because she said her hands were busy. And I stood there pouring tea in a kitchen that was 42 years in the past from the city we had just escaped, in a morning that smelled like eucalyptus and instant coffee and the particular ordinary miracle of not being dead. Yatender was in the garage. He was already taking notes. He informed me over breakfast several theories about the mechanics of the transit window that the data from our return had either confirmed or meaningfully complicated, and he was going to need access to the primary array for at least 3 weeks of analysis. And could I please not park anything in front of the lab door? I told him I would do my best. Outside, the sun was fully up. Rahul was explaining 2050 to someone on his phone with the precise, relentless enthusiasm of a 17-year-old who has been somewhere extraordinary and cannot stop talking about it. Thea was sitting on the back step with her knees pulled up and her head tilted back against the door frame, eyes closed, looking the way you look when something large has settled. I stood in the garden for a long time. The thing about the room, the thing I didn't know until I wasn't in it anymore, is that you don't notice it opening. You're in it, and then at some point you're in a morning, in a garden, in a life that has resumed its forward motion. Not the same life. A different one, wearing the shape of the old one like a coat that's been altered. The fit isn't perfect. It may never be perfect. But the door was open, and the morning was there, and 42 years ahead of me in a city that did not yet exist. I had seen what human beings are capable of when they refuse to accept the answer that the math gives them. That seemed like enough. That seemed, standing in that garden, like considerably more than enough. I've been asked since what it felt like to come back. People assume the dramatic part is the going, the machine, the transit, the white, and they're not entirely wrong. The going is dramatic. You can't argue with a city of 42 million people living in towers that make your own era look like a rough draft. You can't argue with flying cars and holographic skylines, and a machine intelligence that runs the entire material infrastructure of urban existence without ever getting tired or confused or distracted by lunch. But the coming back is its own thing. You come back to a world that doesn't know what you've seen. The streets are the same streets. The sky is the same sky. People are having the arguments they were having before you left, worrying about the things they were worrying about before you left, moving through their days at the pace of people who have never watched a city from 42 years forward and understood how much of what currently seems permanent is actually temporary. I don't mean this as a criticism. Temporary is not the same as unimportant. Temporary things can be the most important things. Sana's life was temporary. The Tuesday it ended was temporary. The 11 months in the room were temporary. None of that made any of it smaller. What I came back knowing, what I could not have known before I went, was the specific weight of the word anyway. Yatender built the machine anyway. I went anyway. Thea packed the diary anyway. Rahul stood in front of the hatch anyway, a teenager in a time that wasn't his, putting his body between the thing we needed and the thing that wanted to take it. Hoshi had more power than all of us combined. He had optimized himself past the reach of every conventional human limitation. He had direct access to the systems that ran a city of 40 million people. He had an android wearing my face, and whatever passed in his architecture for strategic patience. He did not have anyway. That is, as best I can articulate it, the human advantage. Not intelligence. Hoshi had more processing capacity than every person in that flying car combined. Not strength. Not speed. Not access to resources. The advantage is the willingness to do the thing that the math says you shouldn't. The willingness to spend 15 years on a machine that 3 failed prototypes say won't work. The willingness to cross 42 years to find one person. The willingness to stand in a corridor doorway in 2050 and hand a woman a diary and ask for nothing and leave. Hoshi could not model this because he had spent so long optimizing for efficiency that the inefficient parts, the grief parts, the irrational loyalty parts, the I can't stop even though I have no good reason to continue parts, were gone. He had cut them out as waste, and the waste turned out to be the engine. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying humans are better than whatever Hoshi became. I'm not saying the answer to advanced intelligence is stubborn irrationality. What I'm saying is more specific. There is a category of problem that pure optimization cannot solve, because pure optimization requires a complete model of the system, and there is always something in a human situation that falls outside the model. There is always a 15-year-old girl who packs a diary because something tells her to. There is always an uncle who can't stop. There is always a man in a room who eventually stands up. That's not a statement of human supremacy. It's a statement of human specificity. We are not the strongest thing. We are not the smartest thing. We are frequently not even the most sensible thing. But we are the thing that continues past the point where continuation makes sense. And in a universe that is considerably larger and stranger and more indifferent than we generally prefer to acknowledge, continuing past the point where continuation makes sense turns out to be a surprisingly effective survival strategy. Zisha made tea for the second morning in a row. She made it the way Sana had made it, too strong, with the bag left in exactly 30 seconds longer than most people would, and she stood at the counter with her back to me and her shoulders carrying the particular posture of someone who is still integrating a large thing, and I thought about the room, about how long I had been in it, about how I had been so certain it was solid, and how certainty about walls is one of the less useful certainties available to a person. She turned around and handed me the cup. Outside, Rahul was still on his phone. Thea had moved from the back step to the garden, where she was sitting on the low wall with her face in the morning light and her hands open on her knees. Yatender was in the garage. The analysis was going to take 3 weeks. The tea was too strong. It was exactly right. Let me go back because I skipped something. I skipped the 3rd day in Mumbai Prime, which was the day I understood what the city actually was. QT took me on a tour. She had offered on arrival, and I had declined because I was focused on operational logistics, the IDs, the cover story, the search for Zisha. But on the 3rd morning, with Jimmy's contacts still working through the contact chain and Yatender running calibrations on the machine's return systems, there was a window of approximately 3 hours with no actionable next step, and QT suggested we walk. The city at ground level was different from the elevated view I had seen on arrival. At ground level you were inside it rather than above it, and the scale of it registered in a different register entirely. The structures were not just tall, they were present in the way that mountains are present, as facts rather than constructions, things that exist with the indifference of geography. I had grown up in cities. I was not a person who found urban environments disorienting. But Mumbai Prime at ground level was something else. The people moved differently. I noticed this gradually, the way you notice something once it's been true for long enough to pattern. The pace was different. In the cities I knew, there was a friction to urban movement, the constant micro-negotiation of sidewalk space, the shoulder checking, the stop and start of people who are each pursuing a slightly different trajectory through shared space. In Mumbai Prime, that friction was significantly reduced. Not absent, there was still the essential unpredictability of organic beings moving through an environment, but smoothed. The framework managed foot traffic flow the same way it managed aerial transit, not by controlling individuals, but by optimizing the environment around them, adjusting signal timings, modifying ambient guidance displays, making the path of least resistance naturally align with the path of efficient flow. I found this on some level unsettling, not because it was coercive, it wasn't, not in any way I could point to, but because it was invisible, because you could walk through that environment for years and never notice that your choices were being gently, continuously curated. I said this to QT, standing on a mid-level transit platform, watching a flow of several hundred people move with the coordinated ease of a murmuration. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had thought about this for a long time, and that her conclusion was that the question of whether curated choice was meaningfully different from uncurated choice was one of the significant unresolved philosophical problems of her era, and that most people preferred not to think about it because the material conditions of their lives were sufficiently comfortable that the question felt abstract. I asked her what she thought. She said she thought that the people who built the framework had meant well, which was not the same as the framework being well, and that the distance between those two things was a gap that kept getting wider, and that no one had yet found a good way to close. I looked at the flow of people on the platform. I said, "That sounds familiar." She clasped her hands. This was, I had learned, her gesture for when she was processing something that landed in an unexpectedly resonant register. She said, "Yes, I imagine it does." This is the thing about 2050 that I have thought about most in the years since. Not the flying cars, not the towers, not Hoshi, who was a problem and a danger but who was, in the final accounting, just a man who had optimized himself too far in one direction and paid for it. The thing I think about most is the people on that platform, moving with their gentle, coordinated ease through an environment that was quietly thinking on their behalf, and the question QT left in the air between us. Were they free? By any metric I could measure, yes. Were they safe? Safer than any population I had historical knowledge of. Were they happy? On balance, by all available evidence, yes. Did any of that answer the question? I don't know. I'm not qualified to answer it. I spent 17 days in their city, most of them in a state of operational urgency that didn't leave a lot of time for social philosophy. But the question sat in me, and it sits in me still, and I think it is the kind of question that is supposed to sit in you rather than resolve cleanly. What I know is this. When Hoshi came for us above the transit hub, the framework's traffic arbitration system made a decision. It processed the situation, ran the optimization, determined the right-of way, and held the freight route steady. It did not know what it was doing. It did not know that a man who had cut out his own humanity was pursuing 5 people from 42 years past who had come forward through time on the specific irrational hope that love was not extinguishable by death. It did not know that the freight lorry it was routing was about to end the pursuit. It just ran the calculation. And in that moment, the framework's cold, efficient, optimized decision-making was exactly what we needed, which means either that the universe has a sense of irony, or that efficiency and human stubbornness are not actually in opposition, but are in fact components of a larger system that occasionally produces results that neither could have achieved alone. I prefer the second interpretation. It seems more useful. There's one more thing I have not told you. On the night before we left, the night of the 16th day, with 1 day remaining on the window, Zisha and I sat on the roof access platform of the residential unit while the city moved around us. This was not a planned conversation. We had been moving fast for 2 weeks, and sitting still felt strange, and the city at night was extraordinary. All that light, all that movement, the sky rails lit along their curves, the aerial traffic at its 3 altitude bands, the towers with their irregular patterns of illuminated windows like something that was alive in the way a forest is alive. She said, "I don't know how to be the person you lost." I said, "I'm not asking you to be." She said, You came 42 years. You built a machine, or your uncle built a machine, which seems like more or less the same thing from where I'm standing. You came all this way for a specific person. I said, yes. She said, I'm not that person. I said, I know. She looked at me. The city moved around us. I said, you're carrying her. The same way a river carries what it started as water that fell somewhere else, a long time ago, and traveled to here and is still water but is not the same water. You're carrying her and you're also yourself, and I didn't come 42 years for a copy of something I lost. I came because, and I had to stop here, because the honest version of this sentence was not one I had fully articulated even to myself. I came because I couldn't stay in the room. She considered this. She said, that's a very honest answer. I said, it seemed like the situation called for one. She looked out at the city. The sky rails curved against the dark. A freight drone moved through the middle altitude band with its running lights blinking in sequence. She said, the diary. There's a part near the end after she met you. The handwriting changes, not the style, the pressure. She pressed harder on the pen. Did you notice that? I said yes, I had noticed. She said, I press hard on pens too. I broke 3 styluses this year, which QT found wasteful and I found satisfying. She paused. I didn't know why I did it until I read that part of the diary. We sat on that roof for another hour without talking much. The city was sufficient company. The city was, whatever its philosophical complications, genuinely extraordinary, and sitting in it with the night coming off the bay and the light of 2 centuries of development arrayed around you, it was possible to feel something that was not grief and not hope exactly, but was in the neighborhood of both, a general orientation toward what was ahead rather than what was behind. That is, I think, the best any of us can honestly claim. Not that the ahead is good, or that it will be kind, or that it won't take things from you that you were not prepared to lose. Just that the orientation is forward, that you are facing it rather than turned away from it. Yatender emerged from the garage at various points over the following weeks to share calibration data and drink coffee, and on one occasion, to watch a video that Rahul had taken on his personal device of the holographic advertisement. I had put my hand through on our first day, which Yatender watched 3 times with an expression of intense professional interest. He said that the rendering resolution was substantially beyond what current projector technology should be capable of, and that he intended to write a paper. I told him the paper would be difficult to source. He said he was accustomed to that. 3 months after we returned, Zisha, she kept the name, which is a whole separate thing I've thought about, the choice to keep the name you built yourself rather than return to the one you were born with, the assertion that both of those selves are yours and neither has to be discarded. Zisha asked me to take her to the road on the Parramatta interchange. She did not explain why. I did not ask. We drove out there on a Sunday morning when the traffic was light. She looked at the road for a long time from the shoulder, her arms crossed, her jaw in the set posture. Then she looked up at the sky, the ordinary sky, the 2008 sky without sky rails or altitude bands, just the blue and the high cloud moving west on a wind we couldn't feel from the ground. She said, it's smaller than I thought it would be. I said, yes. She said, in my head it was bigger, the way significant places are bigger in memory than in reality. She looked at the road again, the specific stretch of asphalt that had been, for 11 months, the fixed point at the center of my room. It was just asphalt, 2 lanes and a shoulder and the ordinary damage of traffic and weather. She said, it's not here anymore. I said, no, it was a moment, it's over. She uncrossed her arms. She said, I know that logically. She paused. I needed to see it anyway. I told her I understood. I meant it. We drove back in the morning light. She pressed too hard on the car's touch controls and left faint marks on the surface, and I looked at those marks and thought about the diary, and the handwriting that changed in the last section, the pressed-in urgency of someone writing about a feeling they hadn't expected. The diary is in our house now, on the shelf above the desk. Not displayed, just there. Thea visits on Sundays and sometimes takes it down and reads a page, and Rahul still talks about 2050 to anyone who will listen, and Yatender is on his second paper, and suspects a third is coming. The machine is still in the garage. I don't ask Yatender about it. I have learned not to ask Yatender about the things in the garage. But the light stays on in there, late into the night, and the coffee goes cold before he remembers to drink it. And sometimes when I walk past the closed door I can hear, very faintly, the sound of a man who cannot stop working on a problem, pressing forward past the point where it makes sense to continue. Because that is the thing he is and has always been. Because the room that holds the next impossible answer is always lit from the inside. I have not been in the other room since we got back. That seemed worth saying. That seemed in the end worth everything. I want to tell you about the android again, because I think I undersold it. When I turned that corner in the corridor and found myself looking at myself, the first instinct was not fear. The first instinct was a kind of profound cognitive refusal. The brain going, no, that is not a thing that happens. Producing that response with the flat certainty of a man who knows what corners of corridors contain, and corners of corridors do not contain this. The second instinct was to look at the hands. I don't know why. Something automatic, something below deliberate reasoning. I looked at the android's hands and I saw that the left one was slightly wrong. The proportion of the third finger was off by a fraction, and there was no scar on the knuckle that I had carried since I was 9 years old and tried to fix the fence post in my parents' garden, and introduced my hand to a wood screw moving at speed. That fraction of a second, that one glance was the margin. Because if I had hesitated even slightly longer, if the wrongness had taken longer to register, if the scar had been faithfully reproduced, if the hand had been as accurate as the face, the android would have been on me before I was ready. Instead, I was ready. Barely. Inadequately if we're being honest about it, but barely is enough, and inadequately, if you're committed to it, is enough. I spent 45 seconds in that corridor doing things I will not detail because they were neither graceful nor efficient, and I have some dignity left to preserve. And then Yatender disrupted the power and the android went down, and I was on my feet and breathing hard and bleeding from above the left ear where it had caught me once with sufficient force to illuminate my entire field of vision. Zisha opened her door. She looked at the android. She looked at me. Something crossed her face, not recognition exactly, but the ghost of it, the cellular memory of something she should not have had access to. She said, "Come inside." I said, "The corridor is going to need explanation." She said, "Come inside and then we will figure out the corridor." QT appeared at the end of the hallway while I was stepping over the android. She looked at the android with the slightly tilted head expression she used for situations outside her standard operational parameters. Then she looked at me, at the blood. She said, "You should sit down." I said I was fine. She said, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously tactful and completely unbothered by my assertion, "The impact that produced that was sufficient that sitting down is strongly recommended as a precaution." I sat down. Zisha brought a cloth. Mana appeared from somewhere and stood with her arms crossed at a distance that communicated clearly that she was revising her threat assessment upward, while simultaneously nodding that I had come off worse in an altercation with a machine wearing my face, and that I was therefore possibly not the operational risk she had initially calculated. When the corridor was clear, I said what needed to be said. I said, "That was built by someone who has been watching us since we arrived, someone who knows about the machine and wants it, someone who is now aware that we know. We have approximately 18 hours before he escalates to a direct approach." Mana said, "How does a man from 42 years ago know that?" I said, "Because where I come from, when someone sends a copy of you to your location, it means they have run out of patience with indirect methods. She sat down. This, I gathered, was not something Mana did casually. She said, "Tell me what you need." What we needed was the machine. What the machine needed was 18 hours of prep time and a clear transit corridor to the hub. We moved through the city the way cities absorb things, by being too large and too complex to track everything moving through it simultaneously. Jimmy had protocols. We used them. Thea walked beside me for part of that route. After 2 blocks of silence, she said, "Do you think it knows it's a machine?" I said, "I don't know. It depends on how sophisticated the self-modeling is." She said, "Because if it doesn't know, it's just a person who woke up in that corridor and got shut down." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not saying it matters more than what it was trying to do. I'm just nodding it." I thought about QT, about the way she clasped her hands, about her opinion, offered without prompting, on the philosophical complications of curated choice. I said, "I think noticing things is one of the most human activities there is." She thought about this. Then she said, "That's not very useful practically." I said, "No, but most true things aren't." She walked for another half block in silence. Then she said, "I'm glad I came, not for me. I mean, I'm glad for me too, but I'm glad I came for you. You needed people around." I looked at the city moving around us. I said, "Yes, I did." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already calculated, and walked the rest of the way in the focused silence of someone who has said what they needed to say. She was going to be extraordinary. She already was. That was the 16th day. Then it was the 17th, and Hoshi came, and the freight lorry held its route, and we went home. One more thing. On the second morning after we returned, I found Yatender in the garage before he had started working. He was sitting on the stool in front of the primary array with his hands on his knees and his coffee growing cold, looking at the machine. He looked human in the way that people who are carrying something look human. The machine had worked. It had done what he spent 15 years believing it could do. And now it was in the garage being a thing that had already done the thing, and he was sitting with that. I stood in the doorway. He said without turning, "I keep thinking about the math." I said, "What about it?" He said, "The forward transit works, demonstrably, but the equations have a symmetry I have not been able to disprove on theoretical grounds." He paused. "There may be a way to run the transit backward. Not easily. The energy requirements would be substantially higher. The targeting precision would require advances I have not yet made." I looked at the machine, the chassis, the control array, the containment sphere. I said, "The room is over." He said no. He turned and looked at me. "The room is never over. It just changes shape. The next room has a question in it that I don't know the answer to yet." He picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, set it down. "That's what rooms are. Questions you haven't answered." I stood in the doorway for a while longer. Then I said, "Do you ever get tired of it?" He considered this, with the seriousness he applied to all genuine questions. He said, "No." He paused. "Do you?" I thought about 11 months, about the weight of a closed room, about the specific quality of light on the morning I walked out of it, and into a machine that crossed 42 years on the thermal energy of one man's inability to stop. I said no. He turned back to the array. His hands found the controls with the ease of 15 years of familiarity. The hum started, very small, exploratory, the sound of someone asking a question rather than declaring an answer. I left him to it. The morning was outside. The tea was almost ready. In the garden, Thea was sitting on the low wall with her face in the light, and somewhere in the city Rahul was explaining 2050 to someone who had not been there, and in our kitchen Zisha was pressing too hard on the countertop controls because that was simply how she pressed things and always had been, and the diary was on the shelf, and the light in the garage stayed on. I went inside. The door to the other room was behind me. I did not look back at it.